Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome to Ben's Book Club, a monthly virtual gathering looking at themes relating to Benjamin Franklin, the 18th century, and American history. So this month, we will be talking to Lucy Inglis about her book, Georgian London into the Streets, that I have right here, which takes readers on a tour of London's most formative age. So welcome, Lucy.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. And hi, everyone. I hope that we'll have sort of a good chat and a good discussion afterwards.
Great. Yes. Well, as I said, I have the book, and it's actually, I think it's very interesting having. Well, as you can tell by my accent, I'm an American, but I've been living in London now for a few years, and so a lot of this stuff I just didn't know. So it's very interesting to read about the different areas of London and how they were in this time. So I kind of want to know what led you to write Georgian London into the Streets.
So that is probably the core of all the story. So I did a degree in Anglo-Saxon, and because of the way the English degree system works, I wanted to study Anglo-Saxon, but you have to study other things. So primarily my degree was in Anglo-Saxon, and then I thought I would go back and do my MPhil. And I came to London for the summer in order to kind of like work in an antique shop and think that you can tell, can't you, that's kind of a thing. And met my husband. And I never went back to academia, but I was almost immediately kind of taken in by various bodies like Bonhams. Bonhams was one of the first ones I did, to do research into various articles and material history. So I began working on material history, and I became really, really focused on that. And wrote lots of reports on pieces of, so for instance, quite a lot of UK products, even then, believe it or not, were made for export. So you would have a pair of chairs that look English, but they're not, they were made for the Spanish court. And then they appear for auction 200 years later, and they're actually not they're Spanish style, if that makes sense. So I would have to say no, and I don't know why I know these things, but for some reason I would have to have researched into that and say no, these things are they're not purely English, they're in the Spanish style, they're this, that's, and they were made by this person and everything else. And those reports led me into the stories of the people who made all of these things and had these shops and lived these lives, and this was all really, it just gripped me, it just totally gripped me. So I went, like I did what they say, is a deep dive for about, well, nearly 10 years, I think, of these people and how they lived their lives and what the outcomes were, and if they had children, didn't have children, like everything. And then my husband said, "My God, you are just so dull with this. What people do when they're in this situation is start a blog." And that's what I did. And the blog, I started it, I think, on the 1st of August 2009. And it just went ballistic. And then Penguin asked me very kindly to write the book, but they didn't want to just kind of make a blog book. They wanted me to write a proper big, like, history of the 18th century book from the ordinary people's perspective and the working person's perspective. And it just, that was it. That was how it came out of that. It was not it was an interesting time. So
yeah, I can imagine. And you know, the everyday lives of these people were probably not as well recorded, because obviously we know a lot about the kind of the upper class and what they did, because that's always what's been written about. So I guess it must have been very interesting to go down that research process as well. So what was kind of that research process like for you, and were there plenty of sources available for kind of the everyday lives of people?
yeah, one of the things that I found, so I struggle a lot with like royal and court history. I'm much more interested in ordinary people. And one of the things that I found out was, because of the Great Fire and because of the plague, unfortunately, not the Restoration, but other things, is the 18th century essentially became the first truly documented century. So people had to, we got insurance because of fire, and people were rebuilding their properties, and they were so frightened that they were going to lose everything again, that they made very detailed insurance policies and very detailed documentation of their lives that we didn't have before, that which is just fantastic. So there are just so many records. It's incredible. You go back, even if you are researching someone from the 1650s, and you can just find that their lives stop at a certain point because no one records them anymore. And you might get a will, but you might not. If they'd already given away all their assets and they'd been ill for a long time, or, you know, all these different kinds of things. Whereas in the 18th century, once you begin to have, it sounds dreadful, insurance is one of the most important sort of documentary records we have from that period, not in itself, because sometimes you think, I get a really good picture of this household, but then they leave out how much everything is worth, because they're paranoid about letting people know what they're worth and things like that. But it triggers a whole series of documentary events. For instance, in the Old Bailey, like they suddenly become quite linked, that then you can dial back from, and you can find out the details of these people's lives. It's absolutely, that for me was totally fascinating. It still is. I mean, I'm gripped by it. And I think that one of the other things that I just wanted to put in very briefly, because we'll come on to it, is what these documents do is give you an enormous panorama of how London contained every type of people, from the richest to the poorest. I'm not particularly interested in the richest, and to the poorest, but people of all different colours and physical sizes, mental health, everything else. London does this for you, and it kicks in. It begins after the fire, but it really kicks in the 1720s, and that just then blows up into, you know, the Foundling Hospital, all of these different things where people are so they're documenting their lives and the lives of other people, and that just becomes incredible. By the 1760s, it just becomes incredible. You can't move for documentation. And so yes, I was extremely fortunate to access an enormous amount of documentation. Long story short.
But that's kind of a dream of a historian, is to be able to have that kind of wealth of information and resources and all of that. And I think what was really interesting about the book, and you kind of touched on it there, was the idea that it's not just what an individual person has reported about themselves, but how other people have perceived that story or that person.
Yeah.
So so that's really interesting as well. It's and you know, obviously everyone has their biases, but you know, when you have several different accounts of the same event, I mean, you can probably piece it together, or of an individual person's life.
Absolutely. Yeah. and also kind of the sort of the financial documentation, and then their own memories as well, is, if you can get the two of those together, those are really, and sometimes anecdotal stuff is really, I am always like, I mean, I am the teller of the anecdote, but you can't document an anecdote unless you're sure of where it came from. And if you can piece the two together, the facts with the anecdotes, then that's just when it becomes magic, absolute gold. There are some really fantastic ones and some really fantastic resources regarding that. So sorry, rattling on.
No, it's very interesting. I mean, one of the stories that kind of surprised me was this kind of idea of the pig-faced lady that everyone was searching for. I don't know if you remember that story that you wrote about, but the idea that kind of something that was fabricated, and everybody was looking for this fabled person, and it was documented in that way. It was quite interesting. So I was wondering if there's any stories that kind of surprised you when you were doing your research into these people and these lives.
Oh, there's a few. There's really interesting stories. So there are a few. I can't actually pin them down right now because there are too many. But there were certainly two, because people didn't have a television and because they didn't have the internet and everything else. Things like the pig-faced lady became huge stories, and people were just obsessed with them. They were just, but in the same way that people that seem sensible became obsessed with Donald Trump, and now he's gone, and they're not obsessed anymore. And the pig-faced lady was one of those. The Hottentot Venus was another, and it's a thing. It's not a hobby or a pastime. It is the thing to fixate on at that moment, to take it away from yourself. But there were quite a lot of really interesting. So ghosts were another thing that, I mean, it's ghost stories now are still pretty, everyone gets involved with those. It was that was a really interesting thing. I think also that people at the time, so there was so Britain was really interested, and this is really interesting in terms of Anglo-American relations as well. Britain came into the Enlightenment much earlier than Europe, and that's just a fact, and embraced intellectualism and learning and all of these different things. And I'm saying this as someone who actually lives in France, so that was very interesting. And what was very interesting was because we had John Locke, who, as you all know, was a great influencer of Franklin, and his teachings were exported to America. Britain and America had a very, very early sense of it wasn't like a cultural elite or something. It was to do with learning and intellectualism. So you had that huge divide between people who were trying to embrace the rational and empirical and scientific, and the people who were actively not embracing that and going for things like the pig-faced lady. So we kind of had the same stuff going on at the same time across two continents. That always fascinates me from around, and that is very dominant from the 1690s to bit later in America, but 1700 to 1740, that is really dominant, and that also, you know, was a huge part in the Ben Franklin education and ideas. Anyway, sorry, going on again.
No, don't worry about it. Keep telling the stories. We enjoy that here at Benjamin Franklin House. So, but that's interesting that you say that kind of that divide between kind of the Enlightenment and the kind of the people who are kind of not going down that path. And I think of this example that I think in terms of that is like the Resurrectionists, and that idea of you know, the using the unfortunately the bodies of the recently deceased to kind of learn more about the human body, which helps progress, but at the same time, you know, obviously very traumatic for the families whose relatives were being used for this, and this kind of this pull in between the kind of religious fear versus, you know, being able to continue and the science of it.
That is really interesting, and that was the Resurrectionist is a bit of a, it's not a myth, it's a modern, it's like a myth, a Hollywood myth in itself. But what was really interesting, I think there's a lady in, I think it's the 1480s in Florence, and she died at 43. I am assuming because we never really found out, because these things were kept very private, but she wrote to her husband that the one thing she wanted to do was have her body opened. That's how she described it. So this was her entire will. So they had a daughter, but you know, and it was to have her body opened for the purposes that no one else should go through what she had gone through. And so already hundreds of years ago, you have this idea that people thought, okay, well, because we have this in our family, they all donate their bodies to science. I'm not sure anyone would want mine, but and it's kind of it's a hard thing. You have to think, yeah, because you have to sign the papers and you have to do this and you have to do that. And I don't really want to think about that, but it's a good thing. And that's really interesting that started over 500 years ago. And then exactly what we're talking about in the 18th century, there were so many women, and I'm saying particularly about women who died in childbirth and whatnot and everything else, and in penury, so their bodies were essentially free, and they were autopsied, but it led to such a leap in science. I mean, William Hunter and William Smellie and the work that they did and published these books, it's incredible. When you look at these books now, when you go back, the people in America, and talking about embracing science or not embracing science, there are groups in America who still use those books 250 years on in order to teach women what might go wrong during pregnancy and what might go wrong during childbirth through the bodies of these women. And in London at the time, the pull was so massive between the groups who would have said, yes, take my body and try and help someone else, and the people who would never, ever, ever tolerate any idea of that, or how that would work for their families or anything else. And that to me, that kind of sums up one of the great divides of the 18th century. And it's still a divide now, isn't it? But it emerged then as a thing, and it's so clear when you read the documentation. It's fascinating. Anyway, sorry.
Well, for those of you who've tuned in who aren't familiar with Benjamin Franklin House, when the restoration of the building, the conservation of the building happened in the 1990s, we actually found the remains of an anatomy school in the basement of the building, what used to be the garden. And unfortunately, the bodies that would have been supplied to that anatomy school was through, these sort of resurrectionists and grave robbers and all of that. So we obviously we feel that connection to that story, and it is particularly in the area that we are, because Covent Garden was also the area where a lot of these anatomy schools actually were. So
Windmill Street being the big one, during the period,
so it's but I kind of want to bring us back a little bit. We could go on hundreds of tangents with all these different stories.
Sorry, that was me.
But I kind of want to give, from your impression, from your research, kind of what was the life of the average person in Georgian London? What was their life like?
Well, not hugely dissimilar to living in, if you're an average working person and you live in kind of a 1-bedroom apartment now, it would have been not too dissimilar, apart from electricity really is what changed everything. That's it. And so people lived a little bit more in the natural rhythm of the days, I would say. So when it got dark, people were always out and about, because everyone had jobs, and London is a 24-hour city, so it was always on the go. And but people did live more in the natural rhythm of the day, and but yeah, it would have been quite basic, but it also wouldn't. Like, now we have things that we think are quite sort of fancy. So I have a washing machine. Okay, I hope everyone has a washing machine. And people wouldn't have had that, but they weren't washing stuff in their kitchen sinks, because that it just wouldn't have worked. You couldn't dry it in a 1-bedroom flat. And so there were people who came and collected your laundry, and you knew them. So, and then they would, and this is another thing that makes me laugh. People always assume that women didn't wear knickers, and it's just like, if you're a woman, you're like, that's just, no one's going around not wearing knickers under a full-length skirt the whole time. This is not some sort of erotica, like, total novel. And what used to happen was, so this is really ordinary. When you got a husband and you got married and stuff, they used to share drawers. They used to go away and be boil washed. And because we don't have the material evidence now, we have documentary evidence, but we don't have material evidence now. People say, no, women just used to go around with no pants on, and all of this kind of stuff. And that's just it. Sorry. But it's true. And so you weren't, when you read quite a lot of stuff that's based in the 18th century, and laundry, definitely, your sheets you wouldn't have sent out unless you were super rich. You would wash those yourselves because they were worth money, so you wanted them in the house and to be taken care of by the housewife and everything else. But so you would have taken, so you had your stuff dry cleaned, and they had dry cleaners. So if let's just say you were a blacksmith in London, of which there would be one on every corner, because someone throws a shoe and you have to do this and you have to do that. They were supposed to wear, it was a correct thing to wear a kind of like leather dungarees, which you should wear anyway to protect your legs when you're shoeing horses. And it was the absolute correct thing to do as a farrier every month, to have your dungarees properly dry cleaned, because you can't wash them, and obviously every day you're wearing clean stuff underneath them, hopefully every day, but all of these things we think now are that we own, that like this idea of cleanliness, like everyone's dirty. People weren't dirty. You don't have to have electricity and a shower to not be dirty. So they were always doing pretty much everything that we would do, apart from Zooming, obviously, and Twitter, but just in the 18th century fashion, and also stuff just loads of things. There are really lovely. Can I just rattle on for a second? Yeah,
of course. Go
2
ahead.
minutes to say things. Yeah, there are really lovely. So if you 1/5 of the population in the 18th century of the UK population came to London to work for part of their working lives in order to progress their lives and their careers. And so that is an enormous shifting population the entire time. And there are just tons of lovely stories where, so if you're an apprentice, you're supposed to start at 14, but a lot of apprentices began at 11 because they would come from extended family. You weren't supposed to really take on your own family as an apprentice. So they would come from extended family. So if you come from a village in Suffolk, then you would take on your brother-in-law's son when he was 11. And he would do things like you would have a shop. So let's just say you had a shop, and they used to make a bed under the shop counter and put the apprentice under the shop counter with a little dog of his own when he was 11, because it's a cheap burglar alarm, isn't it? If someone gets in, the dog and the child are going to, and then he would learn to sweep the floors, and he would do all these things, and then he would be signed on as an apprentice. And people think that people didn't get there's always this kind of Jane Austen or Georgia idea that you had to be this incredible virgin when you got married and totally prim and proper and everything else, and that's just not true. People got married, so the average age for a married male was 28, and for women it was 26 and a half. So they had already formed very long, strong bonds, usually in their teens or 20s. And obviously people didn't do this all the time. People do what they do now and, have multiple partners. But a lot of couples form these bonds, but you couldn't get married before you were 21 if you're in an apprenticeship anyway. And it wasn't frowned upon. For ordinary working people, to get married before 21 was not, it meant you were in trouble, and no one wanted that. So and to get married at 28 and 26 and a half, it kind of means, you've already seen life already. You've already got yourself on the go. For the sailing population in Wapping, it was 23 or 4, but that's a different thing. And so there are just tons of stories, just tons of little lovely anecdotes, and they are anecdotes in diaries and things like that, where the parents are in the house, and let's just say it's a Georgian townhouse it could be Stepney, anywhere, and they go, the boyfriend of the daughter comes to eat dinner with them, and then they say, oh, we'll go to bed when it gets dark. the parents, to give you two some time alone. And we all know what that means. I mean, no one's insane, are they? And and it's really sweet. And in America, you have the same. You have the same culture with the bundling board and all of that. It's not the same. It's not the same in the UK. It didn't. It was much more muted in the UK. Whereas I think in America, because a lot of people were living very rural existences, or quite sort of close to the edge existences, it was accepted that your daughter's going to sleep with a man in the same bed, but we're going to put a board between them. And it wasn't like that in London, but it wasn't far away. And that's a really interesting parallel as well.
Yes, so I mean, that was going to be my last question. About the next question that I was going to ask was about kind of what it would have been like in terms of 18th century colonial life compared to what it was like in London, for example, because you know, Benjamin Franklin, when he lived in Europe, you know, especially in France, people were kind of fascinated by that kind of rural aesthetic that he was, you know, portraying himself as. But
Yes.
while he was here in the UK, he was trying to play more the part of the British gentleman. But it's that people just seem to be fascinated by that kind of like America rural kind of lifestyle in the colonial period.
Yeah, that's really interesting as well, because also Jefferson had a very mobile identity as well, depending on where he was. So he was, you know, very much a man of culture when he wanted to be, and that's completely different. So yeah, people. I think what the thing with London is that it's really very small, so you can walk around in a couple of hours, can't you? I mean, you know this. So the historical centre of London, it's so small, and I think people were totally boggled. And also, so a lot of, as I was saying, a fifth of the population came to work from rural backgrounds, and so they were totally boggled and then full of like romantic ideas about the vastness of America. And I think that's still true now, because they kind of had this idea of potential and not wealth necessarily, but self-sufficiency and everything that they couldn't have achieved in the UK and were achieving in London. But then the rurality, rurality, is that even a word? The rural nature of that American life really appealed. So I think Franklin, he definitely played on that. But what was really interesting was that Franklin managed to combine a completely sort of sense of rural, that massive sense of American possibility, like him just jumping in the Thames and swimming to Chelsea. He had a very definite urban sensibility, didn't he? I mean, he did, there's no question. And that is a really interesting parallel, the two countries being parallel, and what's really amazing, you get incredible stuff. So London was really, so Scotland was extremely dynamic in making Edinburgh, nowhere else, making tools for disabled people. So if you were herniated, or if you had a club foot, or you were in a wheelchair, or any of these things, Scotland were fantastic at this. And it was exported, they came to London and set up, lots of different people set up stuff in London, and in a place called, the main place was Spinning Wheel Alley, which is it's under the Barbican now. But other places were Blackfriars and Fleet Street were main centres for this. And what's really interesting is that very often one brother, or it was usually brothers, they would go off to America, and you get these amazing trade cards that say maker of corsets for scoliosis, but they didn't use scoliosis, clearly, twisted backs and all of this. And then it says also in Boston. And you're like, what? My brother is in Boston. Oh, yeah, sure. Because fine, yeah, I mean, because if you were going to put that, if you're going to have a card made, it's an expensive do, and why not just say your brother's in America anyway? And my brother is doing the same in Boston. Yeah, or Philadelphia was the big one for the disability aids and stuff like that. But it's just that I always think is that those cards, when you come across those cards, you're like, what?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is interesting as well, because a lot of the well, you know, of course, we, as Benjamin Franklin has, we always use Benjamin Franklin as the example, so forgive me for that. But you know, he learned his printing trade. He came first to London. So although he lived in this house, Benjamin Franklin House at 36 Craven Street, from 1757 to 1775, he did spend some time in London before that as a young man learning the printing trade. So there's that kind of that duality where, you know, those would, you know, your brother or whatever would be in the American colonies, but then also you had loads of people who gained skills by going back to, you know, England or wherever they would learn their crafts. So it's, and they
did go back. We think now that kind of going to America would have been a one-way trip, and it wasn't. People came backwards and forwards. They accepted that they would, and certainly for business they did, no question. But it's very much, you don't find so many obvious partnerships at that time. It's usually familial, but that is really, I think, a fascinating concept of the similarity. So I was talking to a friend who's an 18th century historian of the middle classes in America, and he says definitively that the middle classes had emerged by 1740, definitively. In terms of the ordinary working people who were self-bettering and doing all the things that Franklin was doing and everything else. And I always think, for me now, that I always kind of set that as my benchmark. And it's a marker as well of how, in many ways, America has developed too rapidly for its own good. But it's also an absolute tribute to how fast they did establish a forward-looking, enlightened culture of working people. I think that's a great tribute.
Absolutely. And I guess because, well, Benjamin Franklin, he lived at 36 Craven Street, which was quite like a, you know, most people think of a Georgian townhouse and they'll think of like a grand establishment. But really, you know, where I am currently, I'm actually in Benjamin Franklin House today, would have been a fairly kind of middle class home.
It's a total middle class bachelor's home, isn't it? It's just what it is. That, and I love it for that as well. It's not now because London property is so crazy and people sort of look at Georgian things and really are really fascinated by that. People think, and it's a museum. They're like, oh, this is quite grand, but back in the day, it was kind of Craven Street. It was an not off-plan house, but essentially that was what it was. So, and yeah, that is how he lived. I love his accounts of London. He's hilarious.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, he spent most of his time kind of, well, where we are in Westminster, but then also kind of in Covent Garden and Fleet Street and all those places. So how would you say those areas has kind of changed? I mean, they've changed a lot since the 18th century, but you know, what would have been the kind of the only word that's coming to mind right now is the vibe of the area at the time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that, well, you know yourself because you're in that area that well, Covent Garden was deemed it's interesting. So the vibe is very different. So you had the city, and the city's the city, so that's a different, because it is two cities, and then you've got Westminster, and then Covent Garden. When it was designed, when it grew up as a market, and when it was designed, it made it had a foot in both camps. So to live around there, and it didn't have permission to, because it's officially really it's Westminster, but it didn't have permission to be quite louche and everything else, but it was. And so you had a lot of the nightlife was very sketchy. Like it, I mean, it's just the same in so many ways. It's just the same now as it was then. The people, the landscape, the architecture has changed. The landscape hasn't particularly, it has, but the architecture has changed. But the vibe really hasn't changed that much. And it's Craven Street is just the type of place where you would live if you wanted to have a foot in all the camps. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even today,
yeah,
you feel you're on the edge of many different areas. So. Yeah,
I think so.
Well, we're just going to go to questions in just a moment. I've been seeing that people have been submitting questions as we've been speaking, but I kind of wanted to, from you, is kind of a final question from me, is that are there any other aspects of Georgian times or any other period that you would like to do more research in as a historian?
I'm very interested currently in the 1760s, the early 1760s. And that is something that I would really like to do more on. But I mean, I'm interested in all history. Once I start reading something or going, I've had it. I'm always down the rabbit hole. There's no end to it. But yeah, it's that's I think the 1760s. So yeah, the period of early 1760s was really dynamic in London, and it's nothing to do with George III at all. It's to do with politics and race and all sorts of different, an empire and India and all sorts of different things that are going on. And yeah, I can't wait, I tell you, to get back into the archives and really, you know, when all of that is available to us all again, one day, yes. And to see what's going on. Yeah, I know. Terrible. So I think that is what I would like to do more on in terms of Georgian London, certainly. Yeah.
Well, so now we have, well, thank you very much, first of all, for answering that and answering the questions. We're now going to go to the audience, who I hope have been enjoying this discussion. But one of the questions that one of the questions that's come up a couple times from different people is, what are your thoughts in terms of period dramas who portray kind of Georgian times? Do they get it right? Is there one that you would recommend in particular? No pressure.
No one gets it. it's not that they don't get it right. Everything is an interpretation. I mean, if you wanted to portray Georgian drama, what I've seen quite a lot of, obviously, of all of these things. Things tend to kind of exaggerate what would have been ordinary life. So not always. Sometimes you're like, oh, that's really jarring. But no, I don't know. What can I recommend? That's difficult. No, can't think of anything. Sorry.
Well,
I'm not a great watcher of TV, bizarrely.
Well, recently there seems to be quite a resurgence in interest in kind of this period. So
yes.
I think that there's going to be, well, there is a lot of content out there, but I'm sure there will be more, particularly because of kind of this revival of interest, particularly. So another question that we have, well, so
I'm trying to see them. I'm not very good. It might. Did they have toilet paper? That's a good one.
that was a question. It's, did they use chamber pots, but did they have toilet paper? Don't know if you can answer that question, but feel free.
Well, there was. I can answer that question. If you want me to answer that question, I can answer it.
Go ahead.
They had. Sorry, I keep going dark. That'd be really irritating for people. Well, no, they used a huge variety of things that included cabbage leaves. That was one. But there is a really so in Queenhithe, I think, in the city of London, there was a public lavatory which was men and women, which usually wasn't so you very often had like latrines where 2 or 3 people could go in at once, but they were usually mainly occupied by men, as ever. And there was a public latrine in Queenhithe, which had been there, it's been there since Roman times, I think. And the man was really shocked because there was an old lady there who had a mussel shell that she used for instead of toilet paper. And and she kept it for that purpose. I don't know whether I'm full of admiration or horror, frankly, but yeah, so people, because this is also why people think that people didn't have sanitary ware and things like that, because once it was finished, and you got rid of it or recycled it or did all of these different things. So toilet paper, once paper became cheap, they had toilet paper, that because they just recycled newspaper and stuff like that. But rags and cabbage leaves and so on and so forth. I hope that answers the question.
well, we interestingly, one of the questions that we often get from visitors to the house when we're open to the public is, where is Benjamin Franklin's private area?
Interesting.
So it is a question on people's minds. But we know that he probably would have had a chamber pot, which was quite common for that period.
Sure, yeah.
And yes. But somebody had a question about what you mentioned about clothes and women wearing underwear. Would they don sort of corsets or other supporting garments as well? I'm assuming so.
Oh yeah, so that's actually really interesting. So in the same way we were talking about the leather dungarees for a farrier, if you were a milkmaid or a woman working in, because we think that up to 75%, if not more, but definitely up to 75% of women who weren't labouring in the house full time with lots of children worked for the majority of their adult lives, and certainly after they were married. That didn't stop you working once you got married. So and one of the most interesting ones is milkmaids, because a milkmaid could walk up to 19 miles a day. That is a lot, I think. And so the idea that they were walking 90 miles a day with no sanitary care, you know, they had their rounds, so they had to take milk to their customers who knew, sorry, I've gone dark again, I don't know why that's happening. So they had to take milk to their customers. So you can't just suddenly say, oh, take to your bed because you've got a migraine meaning, you know, monthly migraine. You can't do that, particularly if you're doing those kinds of distances and everything else. And they used to wear, so very often they would wear a chemise, they call it a chemise, but like a shirt. And men and women in the same household, of very ordinary households, the shirts were roughly interchangeable. Your husband would obviously have his shirts and you would have yours, like blouses, but it would be a clean linen garment that you put on every day. And then, yes, you would wear a corset over the top. And milkmaids were known very often for wearing, like the farriers, for wearing leather corsets. And they had to have those dry cleaned as well, because you had to be clean if you're a milkmaid. One of the things for milkmaids, of course, lots of babies were allergic or couldn't be breastfed or had problems. So milkmaids would take ass's milk or goat's milk to the mothers, and you can't go delivering baby's milk when your baby's starving and screaming and everything else. You can't go delivering that milk looking out of sorts. So even the most basic, you think a milkmaid, oh, whatever, you think she's going to be dressed in white linen the whole time and everything else. No, she would have had very clean undergarments on, then a corset, and then and probably knee-length kind of shorts on underneath, from what I've seen or read, and then the skirts, and that would be a different thing. So yeah, that's what they would have worn at the time, I think.
And so I remember reading in the book about how, you know, whale bones were quite often used for kind of corsets and that sort of thing. So how, I mean, was the leather ones, it's more of a practical thing, I would imagine, because I can imagine those whale bones are not very bendy.
Leather, they didn't use leather and whalebone together. No, they're different things again. Sorry, what was your question?
No, I was just
about
thinking,
whalebones.
Well, I was just thinking the practicality of wearing a leather corset might have been more bendable than if you had a whalebone type corset.
Well, exactly, absolutely. So the leather was if you were a proper labouring woman, and then whalebone and whatever material you chose. So the point about whalebone is that it's really flexible, and if you steam it properly. So lots of people, A, who had disabilities, but B, who wanted a really good shape, particularly after the 1740s, when this became a bit of an obsession. Whalebone meant that you would have the corset made for your body and in material. And then it was nearly always a man, but interesting with whalebone, very often, on the trade card, it says that my wife will chaperone. I'm paraphrasing here clearly, because I have to work out how it's going to fit your body and make you look really good. Again, paraphrasing. And so then you would go and you would have your corset. And also because they stitched the corsets really hard, not hard necessarily on the woman, but the corsets themselves were usually, probably if you were ordinary, and when I say ordinary, I'm talking about working middle classes, if you could afford a whalebone corset, they were so hard to stitch and to stuff with and then so he would steam the whalebone, or the man and his wife would steam the whalebone really absolutely to your measurements, and then he would and whether she or he stitched it, who knows, but then he would stuff the whalebone into the corset to make it rigid, or to make the shape. They call it making the shape, but I'd imagine it was pretty rigid. And they said that when you read accounts of this, it says that your hands had to be so strong to get the whalebone into to make the shape of the corset. That gives you an idea of, and that, so a whalebone corset would probably have been worn by a married woman who worked in the family shop or something like that and wanted to look really present, and then she would wear over the top another garment that to make it smart, you know, but then that corset would have also been washed once. I don't know, probably again once a month, I would imagine, but again with a clean linen shirt or cotton shirt underneath. So, sorry, going on again.
No, that's very interesting. I mean, I think you're right that there was this kind of stereotype that you know, everyone was just super dirty all the time in Georgian London, in Georgian times. No. So it's good to know that that's not true. Well, thank you so much, Lucy, for this conversation. It's been really great. We're coming up to the end of the time. So thank you again. And for anyone else tuning in, just so you know, this session is being recorded, so it'll be available on our website and on YouTube. So if you'd like to watch it again or send it to your friends, you're more than welcome to. And thank you so much, Lucy.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks, Caitlin.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.